fragment of parchment stored in a climate-controlled case within Jerusalem's Israel Museum, in the Shrine of the Book, contains texts that most biblical scholars have spent careers avoiding. It is catalogued as 4Q201. Radiocarbon dating places it at 200 BCE. It is older than any document in the New Testament. The fragment comes from the Book of Enoch, removed from the biblical canon through the Laodicean Council's 364 CE decision, banned, buried, declared unfit for Christian reading. When the Dead Sea Scrolls surfaced at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch were among them. More copies than were found of Deuteronomy. More than Numbers, more than most books that stayed inside the Bible. The scholars who worked through those fragments found something the removal had been designed to prevent from circulating. Enoch does not describe a symbolic universe of beasts and thrones and numbered angels. He describes physical conditions, specific locations, measurable phenomena, and a series of claims about the human body that read less like scripture and more like a decommissioning report. The oldest sections, chapters 1 through 36, which Dr. Michael Knibb of Oxford identified in his 1978 critical translation as predating all surrounding narrative material, contain 7 specific assertions about human biological capacity, not spiritual gifts, not miraculous interventions, built-in functions, standard equipment, things the body did before the text describes their deliberate removal. The complete text survives in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, preserved in manuscripts held at the monastery complex in Aksum, Ethiopia. Dr. Ephraim Isaac's 1983 translation, produced directly from those Ethiopian manuscripts for the Oxford Annotated Bible, remains the most precise English rendering available. The version most Western readers encounter, R. H. Charles's 1906 translation, softens several of the passages discussed below in ways that obscure what the Ge'ez actually says. Where Charles renders abstract spiritual language, the Ge'ez is anatomical, clinical. The distinction matters because the claim Enoch is making is not a theological one, it is a biological one, and the 7 abilities described in the original text have a pattern that no standard English edition has ever presented intact. The first ability appears in chapter 22, and again in chapter 39. Enoch walks through what he calls the fields of the righteous, and describes the faces of the dead as shining like the light of the sun. The standard translation treats this as metaphorical reward language. The Ge'ez does not. The term used is not a comparative construction, it is an emissive one. The body produces light. Chapter 106 adds the forensic detail. Noah is born, and his father Lamech walks into the room and panics. The infant's face is lit up, his eyes glow, and his skin is radiant. Lamech runs to find Enoch and demands to know what is wrong with the child. Enoch tells him nothing is wrong. The child still has what the others have lost. Here's what makes this strange. In 2019, researchers at Tohoku University published results in the journal PLOS One, confirming that the human body emits ultra-weak biophotons, real photons, measurable through specialized cameras. The emission peaks in the late afternoon and is strongest from the face. The output is approximately 1,000 times below the threshold of naked eye detection. Enoch, writing around 200 BCE, described a version of this emission that was visible without instruments. He documented it as a standard property of the living body, not a blessing. Not a spiritual condition, a feature. The Tohoku study confirmed the feature exists. It confirmed the anatomical location Enoch specified. What it could not account for is why the output dropped to levels that can only be captured in a darkened laboratory with equipment that didn't exist until the 21st century. The second ability is described across chapters 14 and 17. Enoch walks through fire. He walks through regions of ice. He stands at the edge of what he calls a river of fire, notes the direction of its current, and moves on. He enters a structure built of ice, and then a second one inside it built of flame. He documents the walls and the ceiling. He does not describe pain. He does not describe protection. He records no intervention that shields him from the environment. He writes the way a building assessor writes a site inspection. Walls, floor, material noted. Next room. At no point does he indicate that what is happening is unusual. It isn't, for the body he has. The text implies that at some point after the flood, this changes. The body becomes temperature sensitive, fragile. The third ability is documented in chapter 89, and it is described not as a gift but as a loss. Enoch writes that a covering was placed over the eyes of men so that they could no longer see what was around them. He does not specify when. He does not name who placed it. He records it as fact, in the same declarative register he uses to document geological formations and wind direction. The standard English translation renders the relevant phrase as their eyes were made dim. Isaac, working from the gears directly, noted in his 1983 commentary that the original construction is closer to their site was walled off, not dimmed, walled off. The implication is that something remains on the other side of the wall. The capacity didn't disappear, it was blocked. This is where the evidence becomes harder to set aside. Genesis describes angels walking into cities, sitting at Abraham's tent, eating food. Nobody in the text responds with alarm. Seeing them was unremarkable. By the time of Ezekiel and Daniel, the same category of being appears, and grown men collapse. They can't speak. Daniel describes lying on the ground with no strength remaining. Something changed between Genesis and the later prophets. Enoch's text identifies what changed. Not the beings, the eyes. Every documented human culture, across every continent, in every historical period, maintains a tradition of individuals capable of perceiving things others cannot. Every such tradition treats this capacity as exceptional, rare, a specific gift assigned to specific individuals. Enoch's text says it was once universal. The exceptional cases aren't the gifted ones. They're the ones in whom the wall is thinner. The fourth ability connects directly to the pre-flood lifespan records. Methuselah lived 969 years, Jared 962, Noah 950. The numbers are standard biblical knowledge and are routinely treated as symbolic or exaggerated. The Qumran fragment catalogued as 4Q202, stored in the same climate-controlled wing as 4Q201, contains a section from chapter 10 in which God addresses the fallen watchers. The Charles translation renders the relevant line as their days shall be shortened. Drive Andrei Orlov of Marquette University, in his 2007 study of Enochic anthropology published through the Gorgeous Press Enoch Seminar Series, noted that the Aramaic original is more precise. The construction is closer to the clock inside them shall be set to a shorter measure. The clock inside them. That language is difficult to dismiss once the biology behind it is understood. In 1970, researchers at the Salk Institute identified a structure at the end of every human chromosome called the telomere. It shortens with each cell division. When it degrades past a certain threshold, the cell stops replicating. That process is aging. It's published, peer-reviewed, and foundational to modern oncology. It's why the human body has a fixed biological ceiling. Enoch's text, written over 2,000 years before the Salk Institute existed, describes God deliberately shortening a biological clock inside the human body as a direct consequence of the Watcher transgression. The lifespans in Genesis don't stay at 969. They decline in stages. Noah's son Shem lives to 600. Abraham reaches 175. Moses, 120. Each generation the ceiling drops, not randomly, in sequence, like a dial being turned in deliberate increments toward a predetermined endpoint. The fifth ability appears in chapter 7, and it is the most frequently misread section in the entire book. The Watcher narrative is widely known. Fallen angels taught humanity forbidden knowledge, weapons, metallurgy, astrology. That's chapter 8. But chapter 7 contains a line that precedes the teaching and reframes what the crime actually was. The text says the Watchers revealed to men what had been hidden from them since the time of their reduction. Since the time of their reduction, Enoch addresses what this means elsewhere. Humans in the pre-reduction state possessed what Dr. George Nicholsberg of the University of Iowa, in his landmark 2001 Hermeneia commentary on 1 Enoch, describes as a native comprehension, knowledge that arrived without instruction. The Watcher's transgression wasn't revealing dangerous information. It was restoring an ability that had already been deliberately removed. That distinction is what made the crime so severe. Returning what had been taken, without authorization, violated a restriction that predated the transgression itself. The punishment recorded in chapter 10 is correspondingly extreme. The Watchers are bound and imprisoned not for the content of what they shared, but for the act of restoration. Whatever the original comprehension consisted of, its removal had been authorized at a level high enough that circumventing it carried the same weight as open rebellion. Enoch describes the residue of this ability as still present in every human being, a fraction of a percent of the original function. Enough to produce what modern cognitive research documents as intuition, the confirmed phenomenon of accurate knowledge arriving ahead of any identifiable evidence. Every serious study on the subject confirms it exists and cannot be fully accounted for by known neurological mechanisms. The sixth ability appears in chapters 14 and 65. Chapter 14 describes Enoch observing angels in conversation. When they speak, the floor moves, the walls shift. Enoch records this without emphasis. It's not presented as extraordinary. It is how voices work. Chapter 65, describing pre-flood humanity, uses the identical gears construction for the sound produced by human speech. Not a comparison, the same category. Human voices and angelic voices are described with the same term, with the only distinction being one of degree. The field of cymatics, developed through Ernst Chladni's sandplate experiments in the late 18th century and extensively documented since, confirms that sound waves produce measurable physical effects on matter. Different frequencies create different geometric arrangements. Sound has physical consequence. What Enoch adds is the claim that this capacity in human speech has been reduced to its lowest possible expression. Chapter 65 contains a line that most English editions render as something vague about human communication being altered after the flood. The jeers, according to Isaac's notes in his 1983 translation, is more specific. The phrase translates as, "The human voice was brought down to sound, just sound." The framing is exact. Sound is described as a flaw, not a feature. It is what remains after the original function was stripped out. The original function produced physical effects on matter. What remains produces acoustic vibration, nothing more. Enoch doesn't speculate about what the full capacity looked like in operation. He marks the reduction as a documented change in human biological output, alongside the 5 others, without editorial comment. He records it the way he records everything, as an observer, methodical, precise. The 7th ability is in chapters 39 and 71, with supporting text in the Qumran fragment catalogued as 4Q204, held within the shrine of the book at Jerusalem's Israel Museum. Both chapters describe the same original condition. Every human being was created with what Enoch calls an assigned reading, a specific function, a gate, a role that was native to the body from the beginning. It didn't have to be discovered or developed, it was present at birth. Isaac's 1983 translation renders the key phrase as the letter placed inside you before you were placed inside your mother. The assignment wasn't a spiritual concept. It was a built-in orientation toward a specific purpose. Every person carried a different one. The variations are what Enoch maps across his calendar system, the gates of the year, the assigned functions distributed across specific intervals of time. And then the assignment was made unreadable. Enoch doesn't say it was erased. He says it was made unreadable. The distinction he draws is deliberate. The document still exists inside every human being. The letter is still there. What was removed wasn't the assignment itself, but the capacity to perceive it. The result, as Enoch describes it in chapter 39, is a permanent condition in which a person knows something is missing without being able to identify what it is. The text doesn't describe this as a spiritual void or an absence of faith. It describes it in the same register as the other 6. A biological function that was present was deliberately reduced and left a gap where the original capacity had been. The gap is not metaphorical. It has a consistent, cross-cultural, documentable symptom profile. This is the one that is happening today. Not in the sense that it was triggered recently, in the sense that it is active right now, in every person alive, producing the same symptom Enoch documented 2,200 years ago. The awareness of a gap between what a person is doing and what they were meant to do. Clinical psychology documents this experience under multiple diagnostic categories, none of which accounts for its near-universal distribution across populations. It is reported across cultures, across economic conditions, across every available demographic variable. Enoch's text identifies it not as a psychological state, but as a biological one. A reading function that was shut off, a file that was not deleted but encrypted. The body still carries the original assignment. It cannot access its own contents. The pattern across all 7 follows the same structure. Each ability is documented in the oldest layers of the Enochic text, the sections Knib identified as predating the surrounding narrative. Each is described in the same observational register, not as vision or metaphor, but as physical fact. Each is presented as having been deliberately removed rather than gradually lost. And each has a measurable modern parallel. Biophoton emission, confirmed. Telomere degradation, confirmed. Innate comprehension documented in intuition research across multiple peer-reviewed studies. Cymatics, confirmed. The 7th, the assignment, documented by its absence in population-level psychological data, collected across every culture, studied in the 20th and 21st centuries. Enoch didn't speculate. He catalogued what was present, what was taken, and what the taking left behind. The suppression began when Laodicea convened its council in 364 CE. The official reason given for Enoch's removal was that it contained too much material about the Watchers. The actual problem, the one Jerome identified when compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, was that the book made biological claims about the body, its original state, its systematic reduction, and the deliberate engineering of its current limitations. claims that were testable, in principle, if anyone knew what to measure. Jerome called the relevant chapters confused and unworthy of serious study. Augustine, in his work City of God, composed near 410 CE, dismissed them without analysis. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the complete text regardless. The fragments at Qumran survived because no one knew they were there. The Ge'ez manuscripts in Aksum have not left that building in over 400 years.